Have a seat on your porcelain throne. It's time to talk some shit on the Powell movement.
Welcome to the Powell movement. I'm your host, Mike Powell, and this week I'm excited to see one of the films nominated for IF3's Movie of the Year for skiing, Matchstick Productions' Calm Beneath Castles. When thinking of IF3 nominated films, I've already seen Jeff Thomas's masterpiece, Beyond, and it blew my mind how many athletes and how much footage he was working with. Last week, I mentioned how much I loved the nominated Camp Blank movie, and the two IF3 nominated movies that I haven't seen are Level 1's Wasteland and Christoph Thorsson's Circle of Madness. But IF3 is right around the corner, and if you're in Whistler, you should buy a ticket and check it out. It's the best movie awards in skiing and snowboarding. While that event is rad, it's a bummer that the Powder Awards are dead. IF3 is great and all, but Powder set the standard for movie awards in skiing. I was honored to host that award ceremony 4 years in a row, and it was always so fun to see the genuine stoke on the athletes' faces when they won an award. Plus, it really brought the industry together. And now, it appears Powder Magazine is back. This year they're going to have 2 issues, a buyer's guide and a photo annual, and that's exciting. The group that's bringing it to us, the Arena Group, well, their track record with handling print and journalists may not be the best. You can ask anyone over at Sports Illustrated about that. But as of today, they have the right people in place to make great things happen for Powder. But like with everything owned by the corporate world, they better turn a profit quickly or else. I'm not going to make any bold predictions about the future of Powder because usually when I do that, bad things happen. My only advice to Powder and Bomb Snow and Mountain Gazette and all the other print publications out there that have gone from 0 to 60 quickly since the death of print years ago is to increase your font size. I put a post about this on social media a while back, and my wife made fun of me for sounding like I'm an old person. But you know who's reading and subscribing to print for the most part? People 35 and up. I mean, we subscribe my kid to Thrasher, and he does flip through the pages, but he's done in about 5 minutes. And other than that, I can't think of the last time I've seen anyone under 35 to have a magazine in their hand, and that's at airports, on trains, wherever. My take on magazines is that they're great, but even I don't read many of the articles anymore, unless I can get them on my phone. And the ads? Well, they have no impact these days. To pay $10,000 for a page isn't what it used to be. I mean, for that money, you can almost get 52 weeks of my podcast and hit hundreds of thousands of ears with a minute-long ad read and 2 mentions, and deeper interviews than could ever happen in print. So while I love print for nostalgia's sake, and I want you to subscribe to great print mags and support people like Mike Rogie and the staff at Powder because I love them, digital advertising in places where people are seeking out content that they want is the best place to advertise. And there's no better way to get that message across than by telling your potential customers exactly what you want over a minute-long read. So brands, if you're listening and you want to actually drive sales in a trackable way for way less money, email me at mike@thepowellmovement.com. I can send you a deck. I do have one ad slot that unexpectedly came open, and that's my sales pitch. And while I do understand the digital game and how it's the most effective way to reach your audience, I still love what these new print guys are doing. But whether you're young or old, podcasts don't weed people out with things like font size. Sure, older people might have trouble finding the right podcasts and they may have to turn the volume up. But I will say the podcast space is one where people who haven't gotten their recognition in print media can still be recognized. And since I feel like I'm creating a living, breathing history of skiing, some snowboarding, some biking, and a lot of behind-the-scenes players and more, when someone suggested that I interview Olympian coach and ski development legend, 85-year-old Gordi Eaton, I was like, you know what? I've met him. I don't know much about him, but sure, I'll take that recommendation and run with it. And then when I started to research Gordi, I realized that this was going to be a challenge. I mean, there's basically no information about him online. So I had to work the phones more than ever, talking to legends like Bill Marolt, Tim Petrick, and others to get the background I needed to create a great interview with Gordi. And I'm really stoked with how this one came out. It's another history lesson. And before we get into it, I want to thank you for listening. I want to ask you to please tell a friend about the show. And you know the deal. I'm just a dude with a knack for out-researching everyone and creating the best, deepest interviews in snow. But I don't have a built-in audience. I wasn't a former pro athlete, and I have to grow things organically. So by you telling a friend who loves to slide on snow, that sure helps things grow. Thanks for that. Thanks for reviewing the show and subscribing wherever you listen. And finally, please support my incredible sponsors who really do make this show happen. They are Elan Skis, Outdoor Research, Stanley, Best Day Brewing, and Thermic. Now, it's time to talk with Gordi Eaton. You have traveled all over the world to ski. I mean, you've been doing it since the 40s. And while people weren't thinking about climate back then and climate change, the snow is changing. And I'd imagine that you've seen the impact of climate change firsthand. How bad have things gotten from what you've experienced? And where is the worst of what you've seen?
Wow. Winter's winter in New England, right? It snows one day, it rains the next, and freezes the next. And you go through all that sort of stuff. And that's what it is. So, to be honest with you, the climate change thing, it's noticeable, but in a lot of ways, it's still the same. I mean, you've been here in New England for 5-6 days, and we've had rain, we've had sun, we've had cloudy weather, and frost one morning. That was, I guess, the first frost of the season, So, yeah, I can sense climate change, but climate's always changed. As far as regards to skiing is such a big industry now. Obviously a hell of a lot more sensitive to this. And there's so much money that has to be made with these ski areas in a 4-month window at best. And you need really good people to run these ski areas. There's a lot of money on the line. And it was just sort of accepted that, I can remember spending Christmas vacation in Boston for 2 or 3 days with my family. This is back in the 50s. Because there was no snow, and obviously it was before snowmaking. So it's interesting how that whole thing has developed. And I guess if you're a skier, you're always hunting out the snow anyway, and you're going to find it one way or another, even if you have to do more work to get there.
I was just asking because in my lifetime, I've seen the Horseman Glacier in Blackcomb disappear, and you can't ski on it anymore. So I figured there were probably places that you've been that you were able to ski that just you can't ski anymore, and the only explanation is that things are changing. But regardless, you grew up in Littleton, New Hampshire, and there was consistent snow. It sounds like there's still consistent snow. Winter always happened. It always delivered. And your town was known as the hub for travelers to the White Mountains. But it sounds like the year you were born, 1939, was the year that Mount Eustis, or I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but that opened up. Is that where you learned to ski?
Yes, that's where I learned to ski. And that was the same year that the tramway at Cannon Mountain was put in as 1939. So there was a place on Sugar Hill called Peckett's. Peckett's was a resort, and a guy named Sig Bookmeyer, I don't know if you ever heard of that name before.
No.
An Austrian that came over here and was very gregarious and outgoing, and he was a ski instructor at Peckett's. And skiing was going on in Europe, and these guys that lived in Boston with money would travel to Europe and they'd ski, and they brought the idea back here. And I don't really know how it happened that Cannon Mountain, which obviously is a state-run mountain, the people in the tourism department to buy into, let's put a tramway up here, which will work in the summertime for getting folks up on the hill and plus in skiing, and right off of what was and still is a major highway in the state. And my parents got stoked about skiing in the early 40s. It became a family thing to do. And in those days, in a relative sense, it was cheap. You'd buy your winter gear. It wasn't really ski gear, but the winter gear that you got through a normal winter here is what you used to go skiing in, too. So there was no fancy duds and all that sort of stuff.
So everyone could do it?
Essentially, yeah. And Mount Eustis, I really don't remember whether it was 25 cents a day or 50 cents a day. It was not very much, and we'd get dropped off by our parents, and again, it wasn't the cost that it is now, all hand-me-down stuff. You just went skiing with your buddies. That was delightful stuff. And the other thing, I never really got into racing until I got into high school.
Okay.
So I fell in love with winter and skiing before I fell in love with ski racing. And if I could have a magic wand and say, this is what we're going to do with all kids. We're going to teach you to love winter and love skiing. And out of that group of 20 kids, you're going to find one body that, I want to go fast. I want to race. I want to compete. And now, for these kids to go into skiing at a high level, of course, it's true with any sport now. It's so specialized that they get, wrapped up in skiing 8-10 months a year. So they're not doing other sports, which was, in my day, obviously, winters when you skied, and spring and summers we played baseball, and football or soccer in the fall. I mean, now it's so expensive and organized, too organized. I think it's too organized for skiing anyway.
And you know, where you grew up, it's the epicenter of skiing in the U.S. I mean, I found it kind of hard to believe, but where you came up, it was the first gondola, it was the first grooming machine. And just thinking of that, there was no grooming when you started skiing. Between storms, were the mountains just a mess?
They were, but we didn't know that. That was normal. I agree with you. And when I look back at old films of downhill racing, it's just mind-boggling. They barely packed it out. And obviously, boot packing came on later, but you really should got to tramp this stuff down and pack it out with skis and do it over a period of a week. And places that did it that way, frankly, were Sepp Rusch, but Stowe. Obviously, he came from Europe, and he recognized that the course prep was a big part of the deal. And I remember him, because we'd go up there and ski because Cannon Mountain was great, but it was state run. But Sepp was always a step or two ahead of the rest of the East Coast. And seeing the downhill course, he would, on the Saturday before the downhill race, he'd close the trail and he would have teams, literally, of 10 and 20 guys with shovels. And they'd drop them off at the top of the mountain and they just shovel off the top of bumps and fill in the holes. And then he'd have skiers come down behind that, pack it out, and then boot packers come in behind that. He really had his way of doing it. Again, in those days, people weren't making a lot of money, so it wasn't that big a deal. But he really led the charge on course preparation, to my recollection, compared to other skiers, because they didn't have the control that Sepp had, there at Stowe, which was really an exceptional ski area. I yearned to go to Stowe all the time because he had Austrian ski instructors, and they were mostly older ski racers. And so if you were starting to get into that, certainly in the East, that was the place to be.
And if you think about it, and you're not skiing at Stowe, and you're skiing somewhere where they don't have the moguls being chopped off and the ruts being filled in, you're skiing on gear that is crazy, like screw-in metal edges, leather boots, and non-releasable bindings. And when you're skiing on courses like that, where there's some gruesome injuries out there?
Yes, there were. And when you're young, you're in denial, so to speak. It's not going to happen to me, that kind of attitude. But, you had no torn up knees or that kind of stuff. A guy would get a spiral and compound fractures, and that was the norm. And it's gruesome when you think about it today, now that there are relatively speaking, there are very few broken legs, but there are knees that got torn up, So in a way, if a break wasn't too bad, the bone healing was a hell of a lot easier than a torn ligament, So that whole side of things. But I do remember racing on Cannon Mountain. Ski areas used to have a standard race, and there was usually a start and a finish with no gates in there. We ran at Cannon, we ran down the Cannon Trail on top in Middle Cannon, and then basically a straight shot down to the Peabody slopes. And every area had this, and so there was a time that you could say, well, this is the fastest time of the last 10 years, and the course was essentially exactly the same. And I can remember one year that a bunch of my buddies and I, there was one section where we said, this is the line, and we did the shoveling thing, okay? And I think I was probably 17 or 18. And so we did that. We're in the spring, it was in March, so there was that freeze-thaw deal. We ended up with a perfectly bluebird day, and the crystals were corn snow, and the sun was just on it, just enough to give you an edge, but it was faster than freaking lightning. And I set a course record that day by 4 or 5 seconds, and people just couldn't believe it. And because we had chopped off the moguls through this mogul field, and if we hadn't hit that, probably wouldn't be here talking to you today. Because we were just smoking, and we thought it was the hottest shit thing in the world. It was about a 5-foot swath down this mogul field, and we knew we had to hit it or we were in deep shit. But that's what you did, and if you made it, you made it. You didn't, you were in trouble, So that was fun because we were in control of the whole thing. We waxed our skis, we prepped our skis, we cut the line, and so forth.
That's in high school for you, and it sounds like you're on the podium a lot at that point. I would think if you're setting a record by 5 seconds, which is an eternity in ski racing, that you're consistently doing well. And you end up going to Middlebury College after high school. Were there scholarships available to skiers, and did you get one, or was it just something that you did extracurricularly at school?
Well, directly, no. as I understood it at the time, there were scholarships for really good students, but I was not in that category. And, the other thing is, I'll give you a good example of what it was like. My mom and dad paid for my first 2 years at Middlebury. And then when I made the Olympic team, I took every other year off. And the years off, I went out to Colorado and trained with CU and Bob Beattie.
Yep.
I just knew he had a better physical training, and that's what I needed and wanted. So I'd go out there and do that. And then ski racing was over the 1st of April. And I come back and work for a guy named Jack Kenny, actually Bode's grandfather, in Eastern Valley, building tennis courts. So I get April, May, June, July, August. So I had 5 months to make money. And my dad and I, the last 2 years of school, he made a deal with me. He said, listen, you're making decent money. And going to Middlebury at that time was like $2,000 a semester. So he said, you pay for one semester and I'll pay for the other. I said, cool, that's reasonable. You know, I was living at home and all my other expenses paid for. But I just put that in contrast to today's deal where Middlebury College is like $75,000 to $80,000 a year. And there's no way, unless he's dealing drugs or something, you're going to make that kind of money. You know?
Yeah, it's crazy.
And back in those days, it was just not that big a deal to pay for your way to college, particularly when I could pay for half the year.
Well, college was $2,000 a semester and a lift ticket was 50 cents. And today, college is $75,000 a year, and a lift ticket, if you don't buy a season's pass, could be $300. So it is crazy how it's changed.
Unfortunately. Unfortunately.
What's also strange these days is if you're racing in college, your window for the World Cup and the Olympics are over. It's like college is what you do after ski racing. But back then, college racing was how you made it to the next level, right?
It was, and it was just the way it was done in that time. Like one year in particular, I remember, I was on the Middlebury ski team, and my good friend and teammate, Chuck Ferris, was at University of Denver, and Buddy Werner was at the University of Colorado. And so the previous year, we were together racing on the U.S. circuit, and then, boom, back to college and competing against each other. And it was delightful. I mean, the team concept puts such a different pressure on one, because if I'm an individual racer and I screw up, I'm the one that's out of luck. If I screw up on a team deal, I've screwed up the team. So the pressure was a different kind of pressure and a wonderful one. We had fun times as competitors against each other and then as teammates every other year. I always enjoyed that.
Racing in college, I'm going to assume you're getting a lot of podiums. And leading up to the 1960 Olympics, I don't think there was like a formal U.S. ski team with coaching. I think that happens a little bit later, and we'll talk about that. But was it pretty much the USSA selects the best people to represent the USA at the Olympics? And how do you find out that you've earned your Olympic spot?
Well, the Olympic team had qualifications. And in the winter of 59 was a qualification year for the Olympics in 60. So there were races in the West and in the East. And that time also was a training group. It was not the final team. Okay, so the final team in my era was always 8 men and 6 women. But that training team that made it in 59, there were, I believe, 12 or 13 of us. So there were 4 or 5, additional races that did not make the team. And I did really well in the lead up in 59 and made that group. And I guess it was up to Bill Beck, Dave Lawrence. He was married to Andrea Meade Lawrence, and she was the women's coach. And those guys selected us for the final 8, okay? And I made it based on my downhill results, pretty much from the season before, because we didn't really have any major downhill competitions prior to 60, as I recall. And Max Marolt and Buddy had broken his leg, so he was not in that group. And Chuck and maybe Marv Melville from the University of Utah. And Max and I were 16th and 17th. Max was 16th, I was 17th in the downhill valley. So that's the way that turned out.
This is a time when I would think patriotism is at an all-time high, and it's got to be such an honor. I mean, your family has to be so proud. I would think you're probably a big man on campus at school because you're named to the Olympic team. Was it almost like you were almost famous with all the media coverage and everything that was happening for you?
Well, as a kid, obviously growing up and me living here in New Hampshire with Brooks Dodge and Bill Beck and Tommy Corcoran, it seems like half the team in 56 were Dartmouth guys, And prior to that, the FIS guys with the FIS was also a big deal, countering the time of the Olympic races. So once you start to get to a certain level, you say, man, would that be cool? So that's clearly an incentive. And you did feel a lot of pride and self-satisfaction from doing that. But I really don't like talking about myself, to be honest with you.
I get that you don't like to do it, but you were an Olympian back then. There's 8 of you.
It was. And obviously, I had great parents. So it was a lot of satisfaction to do that well. And I knew that a lot of their friends were always congratulating them and so forth. So it's a prideful moment for sure. I think back, and actually my whole ski experience has been awesome because of the people that I've met early on and all the way through. So yeah, there is a lot to that, but always try to keep it in perspective because, you break a leg and you've had really good friends that were on that same sort of track and they break a leg really badly and they're done. And I remember I took the Olympic oath very seriously. Point being is I had chances to get some money and so forth, and I was so offended. I didn't tell anybody about it. I didn't want to be accused of taking money. I didn't want people who offered me money to be exposed that way because that was a big deal. And it changed just as I was finishing and getting into the next year because that's when Beattie was in charge and we were on snow a hell of a lot during the year. I mean, kids had to live too, In my early days, it was just those winter months and the rest of the year you could work and go to school and all other stuff. So it was always a balance in there that you had to sort of keep in mind. And I fortunately grew up with, my dad was a dentist. We didn't make a ton of money, but we had decent money at the time to pay the bills too. Because a lot of these kids didn't have that background and they needed money. So I kept my mouth shut about that too. I could understand what they were going through.
Now it's time for my first sponsor break. And when the temperature goes nuclear cold, I don't hit the mountain without my Thermic heated socks. They are the original heated sock and still the industry leader after 20 years. It's a total game changer. Trust me, if your feet aren't working properly because they're frozen, you're not skiing or snowboarding at your best. And I make sure that doesn't happen by always wearing my Thermic socks. And this year, they're better than ever. Thermic's new Smart Elastic Technology heated socks are a world's first for heated socks. These set socks are a high-performance fitting, thin ski sock where the patented heat components have stretch rather than a big, cumbersome heat band and element. So they literally feel like you're wearing your normal favorite pair of performance socks. But if heat isn't for you, don't worry. Thermic has you covered with socks for winter with their athlete-tested and proven Dissent line of socks. Some of you might be blessed with feet that never give you issues, but most of us aren't, and that's where Dissent Labs comes in. They've engineered performance socks with the help of an elite athlete team to eliminate things like chafing and heel blisters in your boots when you're touring or splitboarding. For over a decade, the people at Dissent have been making socks that are consistently the best thing you can put on your feet before you get out there. They have a distinctive locked-on fit that never seems to change. At the end of the day, Thermic and Dissent socks are the go-to socks for people that know. Drop into your local boot fitter and retailer and you'll see what I mean. Next up, it's Elan Skis. And while I've been talking about Elan all summer, I've been keeping some information from you that I'll share today. The award-winning ski that started Elan's cult following here in the US, the Ripstick, is brand new for 24-25. Think all new molds, all new sizes, new widths, and new tech. I got to ski these skis last season, and I'll say, the new models are still lightweight, they still have a ton of pop, and they'll still make you a better skier. But these new skis are even more stable at speed, which will allow them to handle burlier terrain than ever before. While you get more out of the Ripstick collection, Elan was able to build them without making them more demanding. So Ripstick fits even more skiers than before. While I loved my original Ripstick, what I skied last year was noticeably more fun, and I know the cult of Elan is going to grow even more with this new collection. If you're a person that demos skis and you haven't tried an Elan yet, make sure you try one this year and you'll feel how fun these skis are. To find out more about all things Elan, head on over to elanskis.com. My final sponsor this round is Stanley, and if you haven't been hearing a lot about Stanley lately, you must be living under a rock. Sure, you used to know them for keeping your grandpa's coffee hot in that signature green bottle, and they still make that, but Stanley absolutely blew up in 2023, and everybody is still talking about them. I've been telling you about how incredible their products are at keeping your drinks hotter and colder than anyone else for 7 years now. I mean, they invented the category in 1913, and while they've always done well, The world now knows that if you don't have a Stanley, you don't have the best, and I love having the best. I personally use Stanley pint glasses every single day, and I swear by them. And my wife and so many others out there can't live without their Stanley quenchers. Recently, I've integrated Stanley food storage devices into my ski routine. Instead of buying $20 burgers at the mountain, I buy food and it stays piping hot in our Stanleys, and I end up saving at least $70 a week by not buying food. While that's cool, Stanley really has something for everyone, and you can check out all their amazing products over at stanley1913.com. Those are my sponsors. Now, let's jump back into the podcast. And on a total side note that's totally different, I know you're good friends with Bill Marolt, and Bill has a long history with the University of Colorado. You have a history with the University of Colorado too, with coaching, with a bunch of different things, and you've become a huge Buffaloes fan. And thinking about that, you were an amateur skier and you wouldn't take a penny because that would be against everything that the Olympic oath stood for. And then with college sports, it's always been, up until 2 years ago, you can't take a penny or else you're screwed. And maybe that does screw those athletes because they do put so much on the line for their sport. And they're not really doing it for their education. They're doing it to make it to the next level, a lot of them. But what are your thoughts now with like Shedeur Sanders making $8 million as a quarterback and Deion Sanders saying, hey, you can't play the Colorado fight song after a touchdown. We have to play Shedeur Sanders' rap song, because that's a totally different mentality. And what do you think of that kind of stuff?
Well, first of all, about the money. When I see the amount of money that the NCAA through TV contracts and all this money, and it's made because you got great football teams with great athletes and great coaches, and these kids are putting their health on the line, I don't have a problem at all. I would love to see this thing get to the point where there's a commissioner and, there's some structure to this thing. Because right now it's just the Wild West.
Yeah.
Bottom line, I have no problem with these kids making money. I think it's too bad that the cream of the crop is what people want. That's how you advertise and so forth. And they're making the money, but it's got to be distributed through the defensive line, the offensive line, and that whole sort of thing too. Those guys are going to be involved in this too. So I don't have a problem with it. And they've made cheaters out of these guys early on because they were taking money and so forth. And you look at the background, particularly a lot of these kids and so forth, they've come from nothing. And they're painted as bad for taking money. And I get it. But when somebody's making as much money as the colleges and the NCAA were making, hey, they're the product. They should be getting a good chunk of that money too.
Yeah, I have no problem with it. I was just wondering your opinion because I know that that oath was so important to you and seeing how things have changed. But the world is changing. Before the world started changing, the biggest thing that happened to U.S. skiing at the time was the hiring of Bob Beattie. Who was he and what kind of impact did he have on the sport overall?
Well, I got to know Bob when he was in college because my sister was dating Jack Beattie. And one of the bigger reasons why I went to Middlebury is I got to know all those guys when I was in high school. So I got to know Bob. And I came to recognize that Bob Beattie was going to become the biggest thing in ski racing. And I mean that in his sense of conditioning, not that he was a great coach technically, but his passion for conditioning, his passion for learning about technique, and he grew along with the rest of us on that sort of stuff because there never had been any real coaching per se. Yeah, they'd hire a coach during the Olympic year, and he was with us for 3 or 4 weeks or whatever, and that kind of thing. But Bob was the first one that put the national team on the map. And as a matter of fact, when I finished at Middlebury in '65, he hired me as the University of Colorado ski coach, okay? Now, the University of Colorado ski team at that time had probably 80% of the guys who were on or going to be on the Olympic team. So it was a way for him to get the University of Colorado to pay my salary, and he's just raising money trying to get the national team together at that point in time. And he was scraping and clawing and screaming and hollering about all these various things that he wanted to do. I mean, I love the guy. We got along great, and I bought into his program early on and, all the way through with the World Cup and made the World Cup the standard of our sport. That's this big deal today still. NASTAR, once we got fired from the ski team and I went to work for him and we did NASTAR, we did World Pro Skiing, we did ski camps for kids. And if Bob Beattie had his way, everybody in America would have been a skier. That was his ultimate goal. And he tried to do everything he could think of to promote the sport, to make it more receivable by the people. Yeah, he was flawed just like anybody, but he was really passionate about skiing and growing the sport.
And it sounds like he's the reason that the U.S. ski team became an official thing, other than something that happened every 4 years where they named a team to the Olympics. It also sounds like you're training with him for the 1964 Olympics and you made that team. But what happened? Why weren't you able to compete in the 1964 Olympics?
Well, that was a bad snow year in Europe, a really bad snow year. And we didn't have a lot of training. And when we got to the Olympics in Innsbruck on Parchikofel, the downhill was really a bear. And they got the Austrian army involved, and they literally were trucking snow from high glaciers where they could find snow. And they put, I'm probably exaggerating here, put 6 inches of snow over the whole trail, okay? Meaning that every single ripple, and it was a gnarly frickin' downhill.
Okay.
And in training, what happened was I took a hell of a fall and tore the sole off my downhill boot and busted the skis and all that sort of stuff, had a concussion, and I wasn't ready to race. That happened like 3 days before the downhill.
Okay.
And the course conquered on that deal.
How tough is that for you? Because, you work for 4 years to make it to the Olympics. You're finally leaving the U.S. to go compete in the Olympics in a different country, which has got to be a different experience altogether. And then you're not able to compete. It's like you do everything but the one thing that you had trained for.
Yeah, as I mentioned before, to go way back, I look at skiing and I look at other sports. Skiing is the only thing that I could ever have achieved that level of ability, okay? Or it wouldn't have happened in golf, or wouldn't have happened in any other sport, And so I was very cognizant of that. And I was also very cognizant of the fact that you get hurt doing this sport. And it happened. And I was sad that we didn't have the good snow, so could have had all that lead up to, because when you get down to training, you start to push the envelope more than if you sort of eased into the season with 5-6 weeks of training on good conditions. So I probably pushed it too hard on that training day, and the course couldn't manage it that day, So you know that going in, and it's disappointing, but hell, you're still alive and we get ready to fight another day.
And you say you're still alive, and I would think the next thing that's just a huge loss for all of skiing and for you personally is a good friend of yours, Buddy Werner. He was caught in an avalanche and he passed. And what kind of impact does that have on you? And is that the first kind of loss to an avalanche that you know of?
April 12th, 1964. It got embedded in my brain and I can still spout it off. And I have a number of times. You just can't say enough about this guy. To my mind, he's the best ski racer we've ever had. And that's saying a mouthful. And I judge that based on the fact he's the only American to win the Hahnenkamm downhill from top to bottom. Darren Rolfs won in there, but that was a shortened course. And I think maybe somebody else too. But to me, if you win the Hahnenkamm downhill, you're the best ski racer in the world for that year, for sure. And for me, it's always lasted that way. And then to see him break his leg in 59 in Aspen before we go to Valley, and he just tore that up. Again, they were not safety bindings. They were just locked down, doing those leather long thongs around and around and around, and he compounded that lower leg, and he never got back to the old Buddy Werner. And then the deal was so tragic in St. Moritz. I went back there years afterwards to that slope, and it's a very benign-looking slope, but everything was perfect for it to have an avalanche. And it was in the spring, a lot of spring snow, which is very unstable, and Bode was filming for a movie, and his girlfriend, Barbie Henneberger, and Buddy tried to outrace the avalanche. And the other guys, they just started getting speed, and then they just peeled off to the side. And they all made it. And actually, Buddy and Barbie made it, and they were locked in from that avalanche up to their knees. And then that avalanche came from the other side of the valley and buried them. It was just tragic. It was just devastating.
Well, I'm sorry for that loss.
Yeah.
To jump into the next part of your career, you mentioned you had coached at the University of Colorado. I think you were the coach of the 1968 Olympic team in France. And then you mentioned you got fired. What did you get fired for?
That's a very political job. And Bob had started coaching the team in 62. So he probably got that job in 61. And Bob, his personality, he pissed off a lot of people along the way. And he knew that, but he still had us, the racers, foremost in his mind. Everything he did, raising money and training camps and so forth, was to make us better. And he was really wanting to build a national team and have it become commonplace and not revert back to the old days of showing up in December and then be ready in February to disband the whole thing. So I certainly bought into that whole deal and was more than supportive of him and the powers to be at the time. Chuck quit coaching. He went in to work for Head Ski.
Yep.
And had a really good job in the Northwest. And that's really what he wanted to get into business. But Bob and I, they just threw us out. And we knew it was coming. I mean, it was not a surprise.
So it's almost guilt by association because you're this clean-cut, good dude, and Bob pisses people off, and you're associated with Bob as one of Bob's guys, so you're gone?
Well, yeah, they fire Bob, I'm gone anyway. I mean, he's my guy. And that's when politics was my first venture into that world and just get educated about the way the world works. And I was ready to move on as well, too. I mean, at that point in time, we wasn't making any money. As I mentioned before, I didn't have a problem with that. But I had one more year of college, and I just knew that Mom and Dad said, when are you going to go to real work, And it wasn't a pressure. It was just what we did at the time. At a certain point, you just go to work. And, and I'm 25, 6, 7, whatever it was at that time. And, it is time to move on. And as it turns out, those are your most productive years for a lot of athletes, those mid to late 20s. But I have no regrets. I mean, I just look back at that and say, for me, it was magical. I mean, Bobo Sheehan at Middlebury and Bob Beattie as a coach and the people. And like you say, I mean, I'm good friends with Marolt and Robert Ryan, on and on and on with these guys that we raced with. Very fortunate.
And it sounds like after that, you worked with Bob for a bunch of years on different ski projects. But the next important chapter in your life that I'm going to talk about were your K2 years. And how did you get your first job with K2 and what was your role?
So I started with K2 in 1970. I worked for Bob until 71. And then I'm doing all this promotion stuff, which was, for me, it's just a bunch of bullshit,
Yeah.
And not that excited about it, okay? And Bob was going that direction, which more power to him. He was doing great. But I still wanted to coach. And so I quit Beattie Brothers, Jack and Bob, and I coached at Stowe for a year. And then I was talking to Chuck all the time, and he was taking me on to come to work for him, do the race program. And after that winter in Stowe coaching, I finally decided to go to work for Chuck at K2. And he had been with Head for a while, and then he got involved with Bill Kirshner at K2. You know that name, right?
Oh, yeah. I was there for quite a long time.
You were at K2?
Yeah, from like 2000 to 2015.
Really?
Yeah, we've met. I've been to your restaurant and stuff, but you wouldn't remember me.
Okay.
You might remember my face.
So we were there in the old Quonset hut at K2, and I said, shit, let's do this. And the winter of 72, I spent with Mike Lafferty doing his skis.
Okay.
And, he came in third in the downhill World Cup behind Schranz and Heine Messner. He had some great results. So I just started in that whole race department. And then I got married in there somewhere. And the travel that I was doing wasn't going to be commensurate with requirements. So I went back and ran the Eastern race program, yet still heavily involved with the engineers on just regular testing of skis. Bucky Cashua, Jim Vandergriff, those kind of guys early on, and got heavily involved with ski testing. And, fortunately, I had a great association with those guys. And then we started making inroads on ski sales, and we just had some really good skis, and it just kept going. I mean, the thing about the K2 thing was that no matter who was the president of K2, and there were varied people there, the middle management people, the engineers, and Dick McNamara, some of the guys in sales, and Petrick, and so forth, that was a really stable passing the baton to these various people. We just focused on making the best skis we possibly could. And it took a little while. And then obviously the 4 came along and the shaped skis. And we weren't the first shaped ski, but we were the first reasonably shaped ski that, just your average Joe could really experience that carving experience. And it just kept building from there. And, and then Matura comes on. And I mean, again, that whole middle management team, in a way, just kept getting better. It's hard to describe, but the leadership that Bill Kirshner and Chuck Ferries established there was special group.
Yeah, I would say from the time that they started hiring people, it seemed like for 30 years they hired the same kind of person with a little bit of a quirkiness to them and a willingness to explore things outside of the norm in skiing, but also focused on making the best product because product was king. You came in at a time where you're clean cut, no BS type of guy, and K2 was exploring in other worlds too. I mean, you've got Chuck Ferries and Marilyn Cochran kind of putting the race program on the proverbial map at that point, but there's also the whole hot dog movement, and K2 helped blow that up with the performers. What was your whole take on that whole thing when you were focused on the race program?
Well, the first time I met the performers was when the boys with Barrymore, they got a motorhome at the time, and that was a big deal, and they painted it all up, and they made a tour across the country. Do you remember the wet T-shirt contest?
Yeah, I was going to ask you about it, but yeah, you brought it up.
So that was the winter that I was in Stowe coaching, and Stowe was on the schedule for these guys to hit at some point. So when they came to town, we had things all set up, and we had a wet T-shirt contest. And, for the town of Stowe, man, we were really stepping out there. And Barrymore, he was awesome. I mean, he was obviously a great storyteller, and he was into it big time. So Bobby Burns, that whole crowd, the timing was perfect. I mean, once again, and perfect also in the sense that they had Dick Barrymore to record it, because those characters were real characters, and they did, like I say, the timing couldn't have been better. And anybody that wants to slide down the hill, even snowboards, I was not that concerned about snowboarders either. I mean, if you want to slide down the hill on a stick, that's awesome, Matter of fact, I got to give a lot of credit to the snowboard guys at K2 saying, you guys are really missing out on this sidecut thing. And they were the ones that really, in our operation anyway, they really were pushing the sidecut. At first, I said, really? Because I was too much of a traditionalist, And then Bard Glenn, I think it was, one of the engineers, he said, just try this, And we went on a ski test, and after the first run, I said, what the fuck? I mean, I've never been so excited about a product. I finally could actually put a ski on edge and just feel that carve right from the top of the turn, through the turn. It was changed forever. I mean, I pushed it hard to buy into this whole thing. And it was, as a big company, we were a big company at the time, and we had the credibility to do this. I remember Rozzy was, oh, you guys are really stupid and all this other stuff. And within 2 years, they're doing the same thing, So that was really an exciting time. But like I say, I definitely give credit to the snowboard guys because they'd try anything. And we were too staid, I mean, for sure.
Yeah. As skiing had gotten stale at some point and snowboarding was trying different things, and it really helped to reinvigorate the whole sport.
I went back somewhere in that period and had my 204 downhills from Kesley. And I took one run. I was exhausted. I was trying to ski like I was skiing on my fours, and it just didn't come close to working, not even close. And it just labored all the way down the hill and never went back.
It's time for my second round of sponsors, and I'm starting this out with outdoor research. First and foremost, when I signed on with OR, I knew there wasn't an outerwear brand on the market that performs as well as what OR has been putting out in the marketplace for over 40 years. That's what happens when you test your gear in the absolutely terrible, soggy conditions that we can get here in the Pacific Northwest. As we all know, days in the mountains are always more fun when you're warm and dry, and that's what people trust OR to deliver time after time. I'll tell you, on cold days, I live in my men's Snow Crew down jacket. This is hands down the warmest jacket I've ever owned. And for those standard Northwest days, I rock the Snow Crew jacket and pant, which keeps me comfortable. And it's one of those fits where if you don't see me ski, I look like a pro. Really, what's rad about OR is the style that they've been bringing to the table lately. While mountaineers have always sworn by OR's quality and performance, Now athletes like legend Mark Abma, world champion Troy Podmilsack, and X Games gold medalist Zoe Atkin are making OR gear look cooler than ever. I've been loving OR products since I first bought my outdoor research rain jacket when I moved to Seattle in 2000. And I know you will too. If you want to be warm and dry and look cool this season, head on over to outdoorresearch.com and see what I'm talking about. My final sponsor is Best Day Brewing. And with snow season right around the corner, skiers, snowboarders, weekend warriors, tubers, sledders, snowbikers, snowmobilers, you get it. The doers of winter are starting to get ready to shred. And post-shred, it's all about après. And this year, do après right. Forget about the calories, forget about the alcohol, and forget about getting in trouble on the way home. Because with a beer from Best Day Brewing, you know you'll get all the flavor of your favorite beer without the alcohol. Whether it be the West Coast IPA, a hazy IPA, a Kolsch, the Electro Lime, or my new favorite flavor, the Natural Pills, you won't have to worry about anything but having your best day ever when you have a best day. Blind taste tests prove that you won't be able to taste the difference between your favorite beer and a best day. I mean, the only difference you'll notice is how good you feel in the morning, and you're going to remember what you did last night, which is almost as refreshing as a best day. So next time you're at the store, pick up a 6-pack of Best Day, or you can always buy some on Amazon or at bestdaybrewing.com, and you can thank me later. Those are my sponsors. Now let's jump back into the podcast. To take it back a little bit, because we got way ahead of the performers, but a big part of legitimizing the K2 race program back in the day was a guy named Sleaze. And who was Sleaze, and how did he get the nickname, and tell us about him?
Well, he went to Middlebury too, by the way.
Okay, so you knew him before you moved to Vashon?
No, because he's younger. Everybody's younger than I am now.
Okay.
He was a passionate skier. And when you ask that question, I'm trying to think how he got hooked into K2. I think he was working for Olin. And I think we had Olin at the same time. I say K2.
Sure. But I look at you as part of K2, that whole era.
Yeah. So there was some association there, and he started to get a reputation of working on skis and doing a good job and so forth, because he so wanted to be a ski racer. And we had the twins on the ski then.
Did you find the twins, or did he find the twins?
I found them. I don't want to put I found them. What I will say is that obviously very aware as younger ski racers, they were really good. And fortunately, they were from Yakima, Washington. So when I got to run the race program, I said, I'm just going to give the twins a call. And they were so thrilled because they felt it was a hometown ski, okay? I know they were skiing on heads or what at the time, and just skiing on stuff. They had not reached the point where companies were clamoring for them. They were getting equipment and whatever, but once they signed on, they said, that's it. They were such great kids and loyal as hell. And fortunately, like I say, they were a Washington ski company, and we're Washington kids, and we're going to ski on this product. So they bought in right from the get-go.
What was their first contract? Because I hear that was pretty interesting.
So Bill Wright, I think, was the president at K2 at the time. And this is fairly early on in the deal. And they were having success. And they didn't want to take money at that point in time anyway. So I went to the president. I said, listen, they're into motocross bikes. I said, so the Suzuki at the time was like, I want to say $500. And I said, so let's just get them. Because I asked them, so what do you guys want? I mean, just tell me. And it's, we really love motorbike, So he said, well, what if we just get them one and they can share? And I said, you don't get it. I mean, these guys don't share anything. They compete like a son of a bitch. They'll only do it if they get two so they can compete against each other. They were vicious. They play basketball on opposite sides. They just knock the shit out of each other, That's obviously why they were really good, plus a ton of talent. But yeah. So finally, there was $1,000. Come on, I mean, we're not breaking the bank here,
right?
So that was the start of it. And then, in a year or two, I got out of the race program, and then it became the norm to pay these guys. And I, frankly, I don't even know what they ended up paying them. But that was the start of the deal, and that would have been in the early '70s. I mean, '72. somewhere in there.
And those two guys changed the face of U.S. skiing, I would think it's fair to say, right? Like what they did, given there was people before them, but when they did that on the global stage in an area where media was bigger than ever, and having those twins, it was an incredible story that really changed what skiing and K2 was to the world.
Oh, there's no doubt about it, because at that point in time, when you had American kids winning like that, and people in Europe more so are going to notice what those kids are skiing on. And our European business went through the roof. And those kids couldn't walk down the street in Geneva without getting stopped, and they could in New York,
That's so crazy.
It was special. They were great kids. I mean, I bet they still have the first nickel they've ever made,
I just interviewed them a couple months ago for something for White Pass.
Cool.
And yeah, I mean, they're just like as down home and as down to earth guys as you could possibly be. Just talking about, I was a little bit late because I was wrenching on my truck a little bit before I got here. And they do everything by themselves, and pretty cool guys.
Yeah. They built their own homes and helped each other out. I mean, they just had a charm about them that you wanted to be with them, because it was going to be fun. That, when they're working on their house up there in Yakima, and they'd say, hey, let's take the afternoon off and play basketball today. It's a nice, cool day. Let's, just boom, or get the boat out. We'll go water skiing. I mean, they've led a very, very nice life for them, and happy for them. And just great competitors, particularly Phil. Man, Phil, he's an assassin, that guy. And he was the first child out.
Yep.
But good folks, great folks.
And as we move further in your career, we're going to pass over Sleaze, but we did talk about him a little bit.
Yeah.
But I want to just make sure we talk about all the big players. You moved back to the East Coast, and when you think of East Coast K2, Goerge Torme was K2 on the East Coast. Everyone loved him. You were really tight with him. Can you describe him as a person and why he was so good at his job?
He brings tears to my eyes. Just a really great guy. And we became great friends. And he was another one of those guys that all he wanted to do was to make good skis. And he had a real talent for prepping skis, too. I mean, he was really, really good at it. That's how he got involved with the testing side of things, is that we made sure that all the skis were exactly the same. And he was the guy you could put that job in his hands, and you knew these skis were going to be comparable to test with, because that loose cannon part of the deal would be out of the picture. And a great Vermonter, was a really good carpenter.
Was he a good times guy too? Like really liked to have a good time and everybody liked to be around him because of that?
Yeah, because he was very easygoing, not flamboyant in any way. He was just common sense. And he had some delightful gregarious abilities too. I mean, people trusted him. I mean, his word, you got the word from Georgia, we're getting it straight. I have great fond memories of Goerge Torme.
Breaking the podcast, this is Mike, and I never do this, but I should let you know that Goerge Torme tragically died, and we didn't really talk about it, but I should let you know, as we're going to talk about his wife in a second. But George was on a trials motorcycle. He was in his backyard. It sounds like there was a party going on, and he was on a log pile, and somehow some of the logs slipped out. And I don't know if he was buried in the logs or what happened, but George tragically passed. And we didn't talk about that, but I felt like all of you should know. So I never insert myself in the conversation after the fact, but I'm doing it right now. And you know what? That's what happens when we're telling stories from a long time ago. And now we'll get right back to Gordi.
His wife, just a few years later, she ends up getting stung by in the water, a stingray or something, I don't know. And had to go to the hospital. And they said, oh, you're okay. She went home and died.
Oh, no.
Within 5 years of when George died. I often think that they're still alive in my first, holy shit, God. So anyway, like I said before, I mean, the people that I met along the way, they all had this sort of commonality about the passion for life and for skiing.
George is the one who kind of found Bode at like 9 years old. Would that be fair to say?
It would be fair to say, now, the found thing,
Or just maybe got him on K2.
Right. I mean, he was the first one that went to Bode and say, this is what we'll do for you, Bode. Because he did recognize the talent at a younger age. But this time, Bode was definitely getting well known. And he took care of Bode like nobody else, both on a personal level and on a commercial level, getting them products and so forth. Became good friends with Bode and helped him in a lot of ways to mature, which he needed.
Because Bode had a unique upbringing. So did George bring kind of the more traditional kind of father figure, or maybe not father figure, but just brought him into almost the real world a little bit differently than maybe his hippie upbringing?
Yeah. I mean, as I think I said before, I worked for Jack Kenny, and that would be his grandfather on his mom's side.
Yes.
And Jack and Peg Kenny, I've never seen kids brought up like a feral cat. I mean, just do whatever you want. You know, it was stunning to me because my upbringing wasn't close to that. But at any rate, the way that his mom, they were into a lot of things when those kids were growing up, drugs. I'll put her on right there, and basically brought up by themselves, these kids. And Bode, he's a really smart guy, obviously, had a great passion for skiing, and they would get him up to the Cannon Mountain, in the morning. And I've had friends tell me that, it'd be 4:00 and Bodie'd be hanging around, and they knew Bodie enough in the situation to say, "You need a ride?" "Yeah, I guess so." So they just take him back home to the Eastern Valley, And for that kind of a kid, I mean, he had to figure out a lot of shit on his own, and he survived. And being the great athlete, I mean, if he had had more of a normal upbringing, I've never seen anybody balance on skis the way Bode Miller does. I mean, anybody. Because he sort of sat back on his skis and was still able to pull it off because of his talent and his strength. For example, I would never say to a kid, watch Bode Miller and do what Bode Miller does, because nobody's been able to do what Bode. And if he had a little more focus, matter of fact, his uncle, Mikey Kenny, did you ever know Mikey Kenny?
I didn't know.
Okay. He was Bodie's uncle, and he was the youngest one of Jack and Peg Kenny's kids. And he was a ski coach, and he used to tell Bode at an early age, he said, you should just focus more on being a really good ski racer in the whole of training and conditioning and so forth, with that kind of a meaning, because Bode, his talent just far outweighed anything that I've ever seen. And he would ignore Mike. And if he had paid attention to Mike, he would have won another 20, 30 World Cups, I'm convinced. I mean, Bode liked doing things his way. And he'd talk about a certain downhill. He said, I hit this one turn better than anybody else in the world. He came out faster than anybody else in the world. But he fell afterwards, okay? But the fact that he had made that turn the way that he wanted to make it was satisfying enough for him. And so when he fell down, And he just had this attitude. And if you got a second, I'll tell you another story.
Yeah.
You remember those shows that they would have made for television shows where they get Herschel Walker and Yvonne Lendl?
The stars. Yeah.
And they'd bring them in and they'd do a sprint. They'd do rowing a boat and so forth. Or a challenge course where you'd climb up over a wall and under tunnels and so forth.
Yeah.
And to get the best athlete of the group. And two things I remember. One is that Herman Meyer won that one time and Bode won it one time. It was quite surprising to me how you'd see all these really mega superstars, whether Herschel Walker or, these kind of guys. And here's Bode Miller from Franconia, New Hampshire. And the one thing that I remember is that on the running course where you'd run fast up to a wall and there'd be a rope hanging down and you'd shinny up the rope and go over the other side. So Bode sits back and he looks at this thing, and this is what made him so unique. He said, I'm going to do this differently. And he ran as fast as he possibly could go, jumped from like a Michael Jordan thing. He landed about halfway up this wall. And with the inertia from the speed, he kicked his feet up like a pole vaulter and hang on to the rope. And he was standing on the other side of the thing before the other guy started shinnying up the rope. So the race was over at that point in time. And that was Bode's approach to things. He was able to look at things and say, I know I can do this way, and 9 times out of 10, it's going to be faster. And he was able to, because of his smarts and his abilities and his strength, he was able to pull that off. And it was so evident. I mean, I'd see him make turns in downhill. I'd say, how the fuck does that work, And you'd look at the time, and he was just smoking. He was really a very special. I've never seen, of all the great ski racers, Alberto Tomba, the technique's technique. It's just physics, right? And Michaela Schifrin and so forth, they're all at the critical part of the turn. They're all doing exactly the same thing. And Bode was doing it different. I can't explain it. He was a lot of fun, that guy. That's for sure.
All right, so that's Bode, and I'm going to say you were a key tester for K2 from like 1990 to 2015, and that was the renaissance period of ski innovations. I mean, more happened in that time than almost any time in ski development. Cap skis, sidecut, fat skis, rocker, camber, and K2 was on the forefront of all that top shape. And you're involved in all this, and you're part of all these innovations. And given, we'll give Elan credit with the SCX. I mean, that's really where the shapes started coming to play.
Right.
And then everybody copied what they were doing, but modified it to make it more for everyone. But is it true that when K2 was testing the mod shapes and they were putting an elastomeric secondary core on the ski that ran tip to tail, and they had all these prototypes and you're testing some in Vail, one of those skis decambered itself like in the late 90s and it created a rockered ski? And you were like, this is the best ski we possibly could ever ski on, but it didn't get made back then?
Well, the way that I remember it is that when you're making test skis, the engineers we had during that time were awesome. Vandergriff and Duraco and some of these names. Let's try this. So either the ski didn't get put in the molding clamp down thing that we had, so that they came out with the rocker already in them, where they weren't allowed to cool in a thing that we put them in to let them cool to shape, okay, to what we considered shape. And we said at the time, we needed an extra pair of skis. This is the way I remember that it went down. And we said, let's just put bindings on that. And we had 5 guys testing. Now we got 5 skis for 5 guys who will rotate it through, which was our normal way of doing things. So I think it was almost accidental, if my memory serves me correctly. And these were the ones that had the rocker in them. And my way I like to test skis is, first of all, I try to find out what's the target here. Who are we trying to make this ski for? You know, middle-aged person going 20 miles an hour, and that's max or whatever. So when I take a ski, I sort of start side slipping the way people start skiing, is to make sure they're in control. So they're just side slipping. And then into the next turn, and how does it initiate and so forth. And then I just keep trying to, over that run, build it up so I'm really going fast at the end to see how stable they are. So that's my routine. So I started this deal, and about the second or third turn, I noticed that, man, this thing is just initiating like a son of a bitch. This is awesome. Then I just started dialing it up, and it was still decently stable considering the shape that it was in. And it was just a hoot. I mean, it's just like all these skis we have today in various ways, how they initiate. And most people still side slip. You watch 10 people coming down. I still do this. Watch 10 people come down the hill, and I notice how they turn. They want to initiate the turn, but they don't like the speed that they're sort of feeling here. Most people. Now, really good skiers say, okay, it's initiated. Now I'm going to just drive this ski. And I was able to do that with this thing that was just almost a throwaway pair of skis. And as I recall, that's the way it went down. Or at least for me, it did. I had never had a ski on edge from the top of the turn, through the turn, and the finish of the turn in my life, like this pair of skis. And this is, as a ski racer, this is what I'm looking for, come to Jesus moment, so to speak.
Well, it sounds like you were the first believer in it in the 90s. McConkey came championing it in the early 2000s, and that's really when it got made, but they disregarded them back then. And next up in your career, there was Spider, then you rep for Sun Ice, and everybody should go to your restaurant in Lincoln, New Hampshire, Gordi's, which is pretty much a K2 museum that skiers should all frequent. And we don't have really time to talk about that because I have my final part of the podcast. It's something that I call inappropriate questions. Usually, okay, I get someone to ask you 3 questions, and they can be anything. And from what I gather, inappropriateness was never you. You weren't a drinker, smoker, partier. In fact, you had the nickname The Phantom. How did you get that one?
I think Bob Beattie gave me that name. Wherever it was, early on, we'd be all together and joking around and whatever, and something that he'd say, "Where's Eaton? Where's he go?" So that happened a number of times. Finally, they just called me The Phantom. I get to a point in an evening where I said, I'm up, I'm out, and just leave, So that's how that started, and that stuck.
Fair enough. We call it Houdiniing these days, or at least I do. I'm sure the kids call it something different now.
Right.
So I'm going to ask you the inappropriate questions because I wasn't able to get other people to come up with them, but I will jump into the first one. What's your best Van Brassington hating snowboarding story? Because Van was a K2 race guy, And when snowboarding came out, and to this day, he despises it. And he made t-shirts that said he didn't like snowboarding. He's done a whole bunch of different things. He's a personality, a big figure in the race world, and an all-around great guy as long as you're on skis. What's your best van snowboarding story?
When we'd test skis, and he was involved in a number of our ski tests, he would have these explanations that were confounding and puzzling at times, but also very spot on. I mean, his use of words were unique. And I remember this one time we're testing these skis and had some really deep side cuts. And his explanation was, these fuckers buckle just like a fucking snowboard, you know. And he was, like I say, extreme in his description sometimes. So there are some ones that I definitely am leaving out here.
Well, that's fair enough. I will jump into question number 2. You were there for the SIA days, the SIA Vegas days. And when snowboarding became part of the fold, it was like there were skiers on one side wearing turtlenecks, and then you went beyond the partition, and the snowboarders had kegs and parties and things going on. What was the wildest thing you saw from the snowboard crews with your own eyes?
I was there selling Spider. I spent very little time at the K2 booth. I mean, occasionally I'd stop by, but I can't think of a...
That's okay.
Yeah, I'm trying to think about it. Yeah.
It's all right. I'll jump into my last one then. And this one I'm coming up with off the top of my head. So you own Gordi's in Lincoln, New Hampshire. And with skiing, there's an après crowd and people sometimes tend to overdo it. What's the most overdone you've seen a guest that you've had to either kick out of the bar or say that they could never come back? What's the worst thing you've seen happen from one of your patrons?
Well, you could talk to Mature, ask him that question. So he had a party for a bunch of reps, and he brought back, at that time, a number of the guys that were on the free ride team. And unfortunately, one of them was, he was a really good skier, but he was really young. And I remember having a conversation with him saying, Jeff, because we have a bar and it's good business and so forth, but we don't have any entertainment, or we don't really try to push that end of things, because the liquor inspector hardly ever comes to our place because he knows we run a tight operation, So I said, geez, we got to really make sure that he doesn't get too out of hand tonight. He was a good kid, but he was young. And I want to say he was 16 or 15. And obviously that kid, he was having the time of his life and so forth. So I must say that with Jeff, but I do have a story that doesn't involve anybody we know. And I'll tell you this one.
Okay.
I think it was the first year of business. And I was at the front of the house and, checking people in and taking them to the tables and so forth. And so I brought this couple in where they had 2 kids, probably 8 and 10-ish, somewhere, both girls. And I noticed that they'd been in the night before. Yeah, that's usually a good sign that they like the food, so they're back again. So they have dinner, and then they leave. And then the guy comes back in, and he says to me, I forget the girl's jacket. It's late August or whatever. It's getting cool. So as he's leaving again, he looks over at me, and I'm at the cashier there, and he points to me with his finger, and he said, and you're a cheap son of a bitch. And I said, what are you talking about? What's the matter? He said, well, we were in last night, and we had the chicken dinner for one of the girls, and there were 3 pieces of chicken. He said, we ordered the same thing because they really liked it, and it had 2 pieces. I said, oh. So I brought the menu out, and I showed him right here, 2-piece chicken dinner. So last night you got a bonus. Hallelujah,
Yeah.
And the other thing he said, we ordered the fish, and last night it was thick and juicy and, so forth. And I said, yeah. And then I got a bit of a smart ass now. I said, they don't come in rectangular shapes. Said, they're bigger in the front, and then they taper down to the tail and so forth. And so if you order the 8-ounce one, you got 8 ounces plus, because we weigh every single item before we put it out.
Yep.
And so he continued this way. He's probably 6 inches taller than I was, a bigger guy. And he's poking me in the chest, and he said, it's not the money, he says, because I make a lot of money. And something just flipped in my brain that said, you're a fucking asshole, when it came out. And I said, there's the door. And Now we're in the airlock. We got, 2 doors, and we're going at each other. One of our wait staff tries to get in between us, and we're jostling around him. And then the funniest part of this whole thing is there's this other guy, and he probably weighed 175 pounds. He was probably 22, and he had this fringed leather outfit on. And he says to me, he says, I know judo. He says, let me at this guy. I'll take him out. And I'm looking at this whole scene. I'm saying, this is insanity. And that's when it dawned on me. And I said, that's it. I'm done. Nice to see you. I turned around and walked. I said to the guys in the restaurant, I'm not doing the front of the house anymore. But I said, I'm done. I deal enough with consumers trying to sell Spider or whatever, I don't need to do this anymore. So that was the end of my in-house contribution. That's my story.
Well, that is Inappropriate Questions, and that's our podcast. And while young folks might not know your name, you've had such a huge impact on the sport of skiing. First as a racer, then with Bob Beattie, then with K2 and the Elan brands, and you helped shape the sport of skiing over the years by taking your snow expertise and brains and bringing them to an office in snow full of like-minded people like yourself, making sliding on snow more fun. Skiing has come a long way since you've started. Your contributions are worthy of recognition because you've helped advance the sport. So thank you for all you've done, and thank you for your time.
Hey, Mike, I really appreciate it. It was fun. I enjoyed it.
So that was time with Gordi Eaton. And with the Inappropriate Questions, I had some better ones, and I did ask them. But Gordi didn't want to throw any of his friends under the bus. So we didn't get any stories that involved friends going to jail or any other antics from that time, and that's okay. Everyone told me that Gordi was squeaky clean and such a nice guy, and no one would even think about helping me with the Inappropriate Questions. So I took care of it myself, and they came out okay. But what was really cool to me was all that I learned during the researching of this one. Who knew that New Hampshire was the epicenter of skiing in the US in the 40s and 50s? I sure didn't. I also didn't know much about Buddy Werner, Bob Beattie, or Goerge Torme. And while Gordi shared a little, there was so much more. But we only had an hour on the schedule, and I could tell that was enough. And I really did enjoy our chat. It's nice to mix the legends that we don't think about with the modern legends that I seem to focus on when booking guests on this podcast. I hope you enjoyed this one, and I hope all Gordi's friends are able to find this and listen. At this point, I want to thank you for listening and ask you to star rate me on Spotify if that's where you listen to the show. Here's how you do it. First, click the Spotify icon on your phone. Then search for the Powell Movement Action Sports Podcast. Then click my logo. Where you see the stars, click that star area and then star rate me. This takes about 30 seconds in total, and it's greatly appreciated. What's also appreciated is supporting my incredible sponsors who make the podcast happen. They are Elan Skis, Outdoor Research, Stanley, Best Day Brewing, and Thermic. Have a great week, everyone.